A trip to the mountains with my parents was supposed to be a light adventure and a way to distract myself from daily worries. Mike, my husband, couldn't come because of work, but he supported my desire to spend time in nature. Yet his support felt restrained. We hadn't discussed our relationship in a long time, and an invisible wall had been growing between us, something I tried not to notice. Mike hugged me goodbye, and I felt his warmth, but also a tension I chose not to question. When we arrived at the parking area at the base of the mountains, James, Mike's cousin, was already waiting for us. He stood leaning against his car, his arms crossed, his gaze attentive and somehow piercing. My parents greeted him warmly, exchanging hugs and pleasantries while I waved. He smiled back, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel uneasy. I quickly pushed the feeling away. We began our ascent up the trail. James led the way. I followed while my parents lagged behind, chatting and discussing what to make for dinner. The day was cool but sunny, and the higher we climbed, the more I felt the tension of the morning fading in the crisp mountain air. James turned to me as we crossed a small bridge over a stream. "Is it hard for Mike to be left alone?" he asked suddenly, though his tone was calm. "Not really," I smiled slightly, trying not to show my surprise. "He's used to me going on trips with my parents." "So he trusts you completely?" James asked, raising an eyebrow. "Of course," I tried to reply confidently, but his gaze left me with a strange feeling. That short conversation left an impression, but I quickly redirected my attention to the nature around us. The forest grew thicker, tall pines reaching high into the sky, creating a shady canopy above us. I walked behind James, trying to distract myself from the strange thoughts his words had stirred in me. When we finally reached the campsite, my parents began unpacking, while James and I set up the tents. We worked in silence, and I focused on the ropes and frames, trying not to think about what it was in James's gaze that made me uneasy. His silence seemed too tense, and it started to get on my nerves. The tents were set up, and soon my parents lit the campfire. Dinner by the fire was always cozy, the smell of smoke, the soft light illuminating our faces. Mom talked about how she and Dad used to go on similar camping trips in their youth. James sat nearby, listening attentively, but sometimes his gaze lingered on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something. Those looks made me feel uneasy, as if he saw something I was trying to hide even from myself. When I went to sleep in my tent, I couldn't stop my thoughts from spinning. Everything seemed normal. We were together, as a family, on a camping trip. But something felt different, unclear. As if beneath the surface of a calm outing there was a tension I couldn't explain. I tried to fall asleep, convincing myself that I was just tired from the journey, and that there was no need to look for hidden meanings in every one of James's glances. From early morning, the forest called to us with its coolness and mystery. With small backpacks in hand, my parents James and I set out for a hike. Tall pines stretched toward the sky, letting in only a little sunlight, creating an atmosphere of twilight and coziness around us. The rustle of the wind in the leaves and the singing of birds gradually lulled my thoughts, making me forget the restless feelings from the previous day. I tried to focus on nature, each step, and the sense of the forest to distract myself. James walked ahead, occasionally glancing back to make sure we weren't lagging behind. My parents were discussing something about dinner plans, and I walked a little to the side, trying to tune in to my own emotions. The forest seemed to absorb my tension, and I began to feel lighter, as if no anxiety had ever been there. We returned to the campsite closer to noon, when the sun was starting to warm up more intensely. My parents sat down to rest, and I noticed our tent was slightly tilted. Apparently, we hadn't set it up properly the previous evening. James noticed it too and immediately came over, offering to help. We got to work, trying to fix the tent setup. "Looks like we didn't secure it well enough," James said with a smile. "Yesterday was a bit chaotic. We might have missed it." "Yeah, we were all tired yesterday," I nodded, smiling back at him. I tried to avoid meeting his eyes, but his closeness, his confident movements made me feel something strange. We lifted the frame and re-secured it, and our hands accidentally brushed against each other a few times. Each time it was just a brief, insignificant contact, yet it somehow made me feel uneasy. I found myself breathing faster, my heart beating a little more quickly. I shook my head, trying to push away this inexplicable surge. After we finished fixing the tent, James stepped away with a smile and I tried to regain my composure. Everything seemed perfectly normal, yet every movement, every detail seemed to take on new meaning in my mind. In the evening, we gathered around the campfire again. The forest surrounding the camp slowly darkened, and the gentle firelight made the night feel cozier, warding off the cold and the darkness. We had dinner, talked about our plans for the next day, and I tried to stay as engaged in the conversation as possible. But I couldn't help noticing that James kept glancing at me. His eyes seemed to linger on me, studying my every movement. It made me nervous. It felt like he was trying to understand something, find something in me that even I didn't understand. I tried not to look in his direction, but every time our eyes did meet, I quickly looked away, feeling caught off guard. This subtle, almost imperceptible interest on his part made me feel a strange mix of anxiety and an unknown thrill. I couldn't figure out what exactly he was searching for in my eyes, and it bothered me. That night, lying in my tent, I once again tried to make sense of my feelings. James had always been around, he was part of our family, but why did his presence now feel so ambiguous? There was a growing tension inside me that I couldn't comprehend. Perhaps the isolation of the forest created a sense of closeness that was hard for me to accept. I closed my eyes, hoping that sleep would dispel all these strange thoughts. I woke up to the sounds of the forest, birds singing, the wind rustling through the pines, and a stream gurgling somewhere in the distance. The peace and quiet of the forest seemed to seep into my tent, soothing me, pushing away all the worries of the past few days. I stretched, feeling my muscles relax after a long, restful sleep. The night had been calm, and now I felt an unusual surge of energy. Stepping out of my tent, I felt the cool morning air wrap around my face and body. My parents were already bustling near the fire, preparing breakfast. I approached them, smiling. Everything seemed so tranquil that I allowed myself to forget all the strange moments that had happened the day before. The oddity in James's gaze, his unusual attention, all of it seemed distant and unreal against the beauty of nature. "Good morning," I greeted my parents and sat down beside them. "Good morning, dear," Mom smiled at me. "How did you sleep?" "Wonderfully. It's so peaceful here," I said, looking at the fire and enjoying its warmth. James soon emerged from his tent, greeted us, and sat down next to me. I noticed that he barely looked at my parents, focusing all his attention on me. We exchanged a few words about the upcoming day, and again, I felt that same strange sensation as yesterday, as if he was trying to understand what was going on in my mind. His gaze was attentive, almost studying, and I couldn't decide how to react to it. After breakfast, my parents suggested a walk in the forest. Mom mentioned wanting to walk the trail leading to a small lake, and Dad agreed. To my surprise, James immediately volunteered to accompany me, and my parents readily accepted the idea. I didn't mind, though something inside me tensed. The thought of walking alone with James evoked mixed feelings. We walked along the trail, admiring the majestic pines and breathing in the fresh air. The forest seemed endless, and in its green depths I felt a sort of unrestrained freedom, as if here I could allow myself to be genuine. James and I exchanged light remarks about nature and our plans for the day, but at some point he stopped and looked at me with a smile that seemed almost sad. "You know, Claire," he began, looking into my eyes, "I've always thought you were special. You're different from others." I froze, not knowing how to respond. There was something so personal in his words that I felt my heart beat faster. But before I could say anything, he quickly looked away and continued walking as if nothing significant had happened. "Hey, would you want to walk to that stream again after lunch? I heard there's a spot with a great view," he said casually, changing the subject. "Maybe," I replied, trying not to show that his words had affected me. I was trying to understand what exactly he meant. Everything seemed so simple and carefree, but his words left me with a feeling of something unsaid, and it made me uneasy. As we walked further, I found myself more and more aware of how his presence made me feel a strange mixture of warmth and anxiety. He was so close yet so distant, and every conversation, every word between us seemed filled with hidden meaning that I couldn't decipher. By evening, we were exhausted and hungry. After a long walk through the forest, my legs ached, and all I could think about was hot food and the chance to sit by the fire. My parents looked tired too, but as always, Mom hadn't lost her usual energy. Within half an hour, a pot of soup was simmering over the fire, its aroma making my stomach growl even more. We ate in silence, enjoying the warmth of the fire and the simple meal. I stole glances at James, who, it seemed, was also trying not to meet my gaze. The strange tension that I'd felt all day hadn't gone away. It had only intensified. I couldn't understand what was causing this feeling, but I knew it was growing stronger with each passing hour. After dinner, my parents went to bed, leaving James and me alone by the fire. I knew that something might happen at that moment. We were alone, and his presence felt too close. James took out a bottle of mulled wine, offering me a cup. I didn't refuse. It was getting colder outside, and the hot drink was just what I needed. "Feels warm, doesn't it?" James smiled, handing me the cup, and I took it, my hand brushing against his. That small gesture sent a wave of unease through me. "Yes, thank you," I replied, sipping the mulled wine. Its warmth spread through my body, easing some of the tension. We sat by the fire, our shoulders almost touching. James started talking about his life, about his work, his recent travels. His voice was warm and calm, and I realized I hadn't heard him sound this sincere in a long time. The forest was quiet, the only sound the crackling of the firewood. We talked about everything and nothing, and with each sip of mulled wine, the conversation grew more open. "You know, Claire," he suddenly said, looking into the fire, "I've always regretted that we were so distant. You're not just part of the family. You've always been special to me." His words caught me off guard. I didn't know how to react. My heart started beating faster, and I looked at him. There was a mix of sadness and something else in his eyes. Something I couldn't quite place. It was so unexpected and so deep that I felt something stir inside me. Suddenly, James leaned closer. It all happened in an instant. I felt his lips on mine, and I froze for a second, unsure of what to do. His kiss was gentle but determined, and at that moment I realized that a line had been crossed. All the tension that had been building between us over the past few days had erupted. Shocked, I pulled away, and before I could think, my hand moved on its own, slapping his cheek. James froze, his eyes widening in surprise. I jumped to my feet, feeling my face flush, and without saying a word, ran to my tent. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, my emotions overwhelming me. Fear, shame, confusion, and a deep feeling I didn't want to acknowledge. In the tent, I curled up in my sleeping bag, trying to calm my breathing. What just happened? Why did he do it? And why was part of me wanting it to continue? These questions wouldn't leave me, but I couldn't find the answers. Only one thing was clear. This night had changed something important between us, and there was no turning back. The next morning, I woke up earlier than everyone else. My sleep had been restless and troubled, and the thoughts of what had happened last night haunted me even in my dreams. I tried to convince myself that it was just a mistake, a foolish impulse that meant nothing. But the feeling of guilt and confusion wouldn't leave me, and all my thoughts revolved around one question: how to make everything go back to the way it was. I crawled out of the tent, not wanting to run into James, and started packing for the hike. My parents were already awake. Mom was full of energy as usual, while Dad smiled as he prepared breakfast. Everything around me seemed so ordinary, but my inner world was in complete chaos. When James emerged from his tent, I immediately tried to move away to avoid talking to him, but his voice caught up with me just a few steps away. "Good morning, Claire," he said, as if nothing had happened. There was no trace of awkwardness or hesitation in his voice. "Good morning," I replied, trying to keep my distance. He, on the other hand, acted completely naturally, as if that kiss by the campfire had never happened. His calm confidence only made me feel more confused, making me even more unsure of myself. While I helped my parents pack up the campsite, James stayed nearby, occasionally stopping by and asking perfectly normal questions about the upcoming hike. I answered briefly, trying not to look at him, but I could feel his gaze on me. The day ahead promised to be long, and I didn't know how to behave around him. Before we set off, I took my phone and walked a little way off to call Mike. My heart was pounding harder than usual as I dialed his number. I wanted to hear his voice, to feel the stability he brought to my life. When Mike answered, his voice was warm and caring. "Hey, sweetheart. How's it going in the mountains?" he asked. "Hey," I tried to sound calm, though I was tense inside. "Everything's fine. We're just about to move on to the next camp. It's really beautiful here." "Glad to hear that. Are you okay? Not too tired?" His questions were normal, but in my ears they sounded almost like a rebuke, as if he knew about my turmoil. "No, I'm fine," I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "I miss you." "I miss you too. Be careful out there, okay?" "Of course," I replied, and before ending the call I added, "I love you." When the call ended, I felt a bit of relief, but the guilt remained. I couldn't tell him what had happened. I wasn't ready for his reaction, didn't want to destroy what we had built together. I just hoped I could forget it all like a bad dream. We moved on, climbing higher into the mountains. James walked ahead, leading the way. He acted calmly, but I felt his gaze on me from time to time. It wasn't just a look. It was saying something, promising something, and it made me uncomfortable. I tried to ignore him, but it was hard to shake the feeling that he wouldn't just let things go. The path was getting harder, and by evening we reached a new campsite. My father looked at the sky and frowned. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and it looked like it might rain. "Looks like bad weather's coming," he said, glancing around worriedly. "Oh, come on, we'll be fine," Mom shrugged. "It's not our first hike, we can handle it." I nodded in agreement, but deep down I felt a sense of foreboding. Everything seemed so fragile, as if the slightest gust of wind could change the course of events. Back then, I had no idea that the decision to stay here and continue the hike would indeed change my life. Forever. In the morning, we finally reached the next campsite. The weather remained cool with a mist that seemed to wrap around everything. After the previous day, I felt tired and somewhat emotionally drained. While exploring the area around the new camp, I found a small hot spring nearby. Deciding it was the perfect way to warm up and take a break from all my thoughts, I grabbed a towel and headed there. While my parents busied themselves with setting up camp and James went off to scout the area, I got a chance to be alone and distract myself from everything that was happening. The crisp sound of twigs underfoot and the fresh scent of the forest relaxed me a little, and slowly, thoughts of James began to fade into the background. When I reached the spring, the forest around me was almost silent, with only the occasional bird song creating a soothing backdrop. I looked around to make sure no one was nearby, and once I was sure, I dropped my clothes and slipped into the warm water. The hot water enveloped my body, and for a moment I felt blissful peace. My muscles relaxed, my head cleared of all heavy thoughts. Here, in this secluded spot, I finally felt free from everything. I closed my eyes, enjoying the warmth, allowing myself to forget about everything. But then a strange feeling washed over me, as if someone was watching me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I opened my eyes, looking towards the trees, and noticed something odd, a silhouette hiding behind the bushes. My heart started to pound faster. "James?" I called softly, trying to make sure I wasn't mistaken. A second passed, and the silhouette moved. It was James. He straightened up, his expression slightly strained, as if trying to pretend he hadn't been there at all. "Hey, I'm just gathering firewood," he said, stepping out from behind the bushes and picking up a couple of sticks from the ground, trying to look casual. I felt a mix of embarrassment and anger. He had been watching me? I wanted to say something sharp, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just looked away, sinking deeper into the water, feeling my cheeks flush. "Maybe a little warning next time?" I said dryly, trying to hide my confusion. "Sorry, didn't mean to bother you." His voice was calm, but I could see he was trying to gauge my reaction. When he left, I was alone, but the tension that should have eased only grew stronger. I wanted to be angry at him for watching me, for putting me in such an awkward position. But to my own surprise, instead of anger, I felt something else. His gaze, though so embarrassing, somehow made me feel desired. This feeling was so unexpected that I didn't know how to handle it. I closed my eyes, trying to push these thoughts away. Why had his presence become so hard to ignore? Why was there a battle inside me between two opposing desires? One, to turn away from him, to forget, to pretend nothing was happening, and the other, to let it continue, to accept his attention? When I returned to camp, I felt that something inside me had changed. James gave me a brief glance, and I noticed a slight smile on his lips, as if he knew what I was feeling. That look made me feel a fresh wave of embarrassment, but at the same time I realized that part of me had been waiting for those glances. This inner conflict tore at me. Embarrassment and anger turned into interest and desire. All I could do was try to act as if nothing had happened, but inside the storm was just beginning to build. In the morning, the camp was shrouded in thick fog, obscuring the outlines of the trees and making the surrounding world almost magical. We all gathered around the fire, sipping hot tea and discussing our plans for the day. My parents suggested climbing even higher up the mountain, to a point with a breathtaking view that the locals had talked about. James immediately supported the idea, his eyes shining with anticipation. I sat silently, listening to their conversation and glancing at the sky, which was already covered with gray clouds. It seemed like the weather had surprises in store, and that worried me. "The weather seems to be changing," Dad said, looking at the sky with a frown. "We need to be careful." "Oh, come on, we'll manage," Mom responded enthusiastically. "Besides, reaching that height is why we came here in the first place." James smiled, backing her up. "Exactly. The view will be worth all the effort." I knew they were right, but something inside me resisted. Maybe it was fear of the weather, or just the uncertainty that had surfaced after all those strange moments with James. However, I decided not to show my doubts and simply nodded, agreeing with their decision. We packed up our things and checked our gear before setting off. The trail grew steeper, and the higher we climbed, the stronger the wind became. With every step, the weather worsened, and the air grew colder and damper. Dark clouds gathered above us, and when we were already halfway there, a light rain began to fall. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested, but Mom waved it off. "We're so close, Claire. It's just a bit of rain." James walked ahead, leading us along the trail, his back seeming reliable and confident. I tried to stay close to my parents, but the anxiety wouldn't leave me. The wind grew stronger, gusting and forcing us to stop and take shelter under the trees. When we reached a small clearing with a magnificent view of the mountain peaks, the rain had intensified. It no longer seemed like a mere weather whim, it was a full-blown storm. The wind lashed at our faces, the rain stung our skin, and we had to struggle for every step. We tried to set up camp to take shelter, but the wind was so strong that the tarp wouldn't stay in place. "Hurry!" James shouted, trying to be heard over the noise of the rain and wind. "We need to secure the tarp, or we'll get blown away." I tried to help, but my hands were freezing, and every knot I tied immediately came undone in the gusts of wind. My parents were struggling too, and even my father, always so strong and confident, looked lost and helpless in the face of the storm. At some point, I felt the wind grab the tent we had barely managed to set up and carry it away, out of sight. I froze for a moment, watching as my shelter disappeared into the raging wind. In that moment, true fear gripped me. "We can't stay here," Dad shouted, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. "We need to find shelter." James nodded in agreement. We quickly gathered the remaining items, and holding on to each other began descending, trying to find a more protected spot. The wind battered us from all sides, and all I could think about was not losing my balance. James stayed close, his hand occasionally touching my back to support me. And despite all the danger, I found something reassuring in that touch. When we finally found a small sheltered area beneath the trees, I exhaled in relief. We were all soaked through and shivering, but most importantly, we were safe. Mom smiled at me, trying to lift my spirits. "Well, now we can really call this an adventure." I gave her a weak smile in return, feeling my emotions still trembling inside me. This storm had shown me just how quickly everything around us could change. Not just the weather, but also our feelings, our relationships. Everything was so fragile, so uncertain. James looked at me again, and there was something in his eyes that was hard for me to ignore, as if he knew that even greater challenges lay ahead of us. We were all completely exhausted when we finally found a calmer place, shielded from the wind, where we could set up camp. The wind here was not as fierce as it had been in the open clearing, and the thick trees provided a natural barrier, protecting us from the storm. But the rain still didn't let up. Cold streams continued to pour down on us, soaking through our clothes, making us shiver from the cold. "It's safe enough here," Dad said, struggling to hold on to the wet gear. "We need to set up the tents right away." Mom and I helped as much as we could. Our hands were numb from the cold, but eventually we managed to set up one tent. Mine, unfortunately, had been lost to the windstorm, as had my sleeping bag. I couldn't think about that right now. All I wanted was to get under cover and warm up as soon as possible. "Claire," Mom said to me, "you'll have to sleep in James's tent tonight. Your father and I will take the other one. It'll be warmer for you that way." I nodded without thinking. I was really cold. Every part of my body was trembling from the chill. All I wanted was warmth and a dry shelter where I could rest. "No problem," James replied, hearing our conversation. "I've got enough space, and it's warmer in there." We all gathered in my parents' tent to dry off a bit and warm up, but there clearly wasn't enough room for all of us. I felt the cold seeping into my bones, and I couldn't think of anything but getting into a dry sleeping bag. "Come on, Claire," James said, nodding towards his tent. "You'll warm up faster that way." I followed him without hesitation. We made our way through the rain, and he opened the tent flap, letting me in. Inside it was warm compared to outside, and I immediately felt some of the tension ease. But then James pulled out a single sleeping bag, and it dawned on me that my sleeping bag had also been lost to the wind. "We'll have to share the sleeping bag," he said, his voice holding a hint of embarrassment, though his expression remained confident. "It's the only way to keep warm. You're freezing." I nodded, understanding there was no other option. The cold penetrated every cell of my body, and even the thought of arguing or being shy seemed absurd. James turned away, giving me privacy to take off my wet clothes, and I quickly put on a dry shirt. Then he climbed into the sleeping bag, leaving enough space for me. I carefully climbed in, trying to keep my distance, but the sleeping bag was tight. The warmth emanating from James began to warm me immediately, and the shivering slowly subsided. Our bodies were pressed against each other, and though I wanted to keep my distance, the cold made me move closer. "You okay?" James asked, his voice soft and reassuring. His breath was so close, and it was hard not to be aware of his presence. "Yes," I whispered, trying not to meet his eyes. Right now, I didn't want to think about the kiss, about that moment by the campfire that had changed everything between us. But being here, next to him, felt both strange and comforting. "Just try to rest," he said, and I felt his hand lightly touch my shoulder, as if trying to calm me. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth slowly returning to me. The rain continued to pound on the tent, the wind howled outside, but here, in the small space of the sleeping bag, it was warm and even peaceful. With each breath, I tried to let go of all my worries and simply allow myself to drift away. The night promised to be long, but I hoped that morning would bring relief. For now, lying next to James, feeling his warmth and presence, I tried to convince myself that all this was just temporary, that everything could be sorted out later once we returned. But deep down, despite the cold and exhaustion, there were other feelings growing inside me, feelings I couldn't yet name. The night was cold and damp, despite the fact that we were inside the tent. The wind pounded against the sides and the rain kept relentlessly hammering down from above. But here, in this small space, it was at least a bit warmer, and, most importantly, safer. James and I were lying in the same sleeping bag, and our breathing was the only sound I could hear besides the raging storm outside. Our bodies were pressed tightly against each other. Instinctively, I moved closer to James for warmth, feeling his body heat. It slowly warmed me up, and with each moment I began to relax. I wasn't thinking about how close we were, wasn't thinking about what separated us or connected us. There was only one thing, the warmth that seeped into me, thawing my frozen emotions. I felt his hand tentatively touch my shoulder. His touch was cautious, as if he wasn't sure if it was allowed. My first reaction was instinctive. I tensed up, but then, as if following an impulse, I allowed myself to relax, not pulling away. James seemed to sense this, and timidly but decisively, he moved his hand lower, his fingers trailing down my back and eventually reaching my waist. I held my breath, trying not to think about what was happening but just to feel. His touches were so gentle, as if he was afraid of doing something wrong. But in these movements, I also felt determination and something more, desire that pulled us both beyond reason. My own hands started to move involuntarily, and I felt that there was a thin boundary between us that could fall at any moment. The silence inside the tent grew even deeper, and it felt like time had stopped. We didn't speak, didn't exchange glances. Everything was expressed through the movements of our bodies. I felt his hand on my waist, then on my stomach, and every spot he touched seemed to come alive, pulsing under his fingers. The sensations became too strong, and I could no longer pretend that I didn't want this. I turned towards him, our eyes meeting for a moment in the dimness of the tent, and then it all happened on its own. Our lips met in a kiss that was full of both passion and desperation. In that kiss were all the unspoken words and feelings we had hidden all this time. I felt his hands move over my back, pulling me closer, and at that moment, I knew I couldn't stop. Our touches grew bolder. James, as if freed from his last doubts, held me tightly, his fingers slipping under the fabric of my shirt, and I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. I didn't try to push him away, didn't say no. On the contrary, every part of my body responded to him, drawn to him, as if forgetting all the rules and boundaries. We were both caught up in the moment, forgetting what bound us and what could separate us. The tent was dark, and only our bodies, our touches, filled the space. Everything else disappeared, the cold, the fears, the doubts. There was only this warmth, these bold movements, these moments in which we lost ourselves. I knew the consequences were inevitable, that we were crossing a line that would change everything, but in that moment I didn't care. There was only this desire, this closeness that I couldn't deny. James didn't stop either. His hands explored me with increasing determination, and I felt how we both lost ourselves in the moment, completely surrendering to our desire. The night continued, and only our bodies, our touches, were real. Everything else seemed like a distant echo, something that could be ignored. And I knew there was no turning back. Morning came quickly, but a heavy darkness remained in my heart, as if the night had never ended. I crawled out of the tent, feeling exhaustion and an overwhelming sense of guilt. James was still asleep, his face peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed, and I couldn't understand how to handle it now. I took my phone to call Mike. The events of the previous night haunted me, and I hoped that hearing his voice would bring me some sense of stability. As I dialed his number, I tried to take a deep breath and speak as confidently as I could, though I felt a knot tightening inside me. "Hey, Mike," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I briefly described the situation, mentioning the bad weather and spending the night in James's tent, but I left out all the details that really mattered. Mike, as always, was caring, asking if everything was all right. Feeling tense, I gave short, evasive answers, avoiding any specifics. With each question, it became harder to hold on, and I realized the lie was unbearable. He sensed that something was off but didn't press me, which only added to my guilt. "I miss you," I said, trying to hide the tears that were welling up in my eyes. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Mike replied with the words I always wanted to hear. But this time they brought no comfort. I hung up, feeling nothing but emptiness. Returning to the tent, I noticed that James was already up, preparing for the morning hike. He smiled when he caught my eye, as if last night had never happened, and it brought a new wave of anger inside me. His calm confidence infuriated me. How could he so easily pretend nothing had happened, that we hadn't crossed a line that should never have been crossed? "Good morning," he said, handing me a mug of hot tea. His casual demeanor only heightened my inner conflict. "Fine," I replied coldly, avoiding his gaze and his false smiles. His behavior made me angry, as if I was the only one feeling the consequences of that night. James seemed completely unaware of my mood and continued to act as usual. His confidence and calmness drove me crazy, as if that night meant nothing to him. For me, each moment spent near him reminded me of what had happened, wearing away at my strength and confidence. I tried to focus on packing for the hike, on the simple physical tasks that might distract me from the chaos inside. But the more I tried to forget, the more vivid the memories became. His touches, the warmth of his body. It was all too vivid, too real. And I knew it wouldn't just disappear. We were getting ready to move on. James was confidently handling his backpack, his movements quick and precise. I felt something tearing inside me as I watched his composure. I was still caught in the storm, with a struggle raging inside me between guilt and unspoken desire. And I knew one thing. The consequences of that night wouldn't let go of me as easily as I might have hoped. The journey home felt endless. My parents, James, and I drove past familiar places, forest landscapes and mountain roads. But inside, I felt empty. I tried to distract myself, make small talk with my mom and dad, but every time I looked at James, I felt that familiar tension flare up in my chest. He remained calm and composed, as if nothing had happened between us, as if our closeness had been insignificant and unnoticed. When we finally returned home, I felt a sense of relief. It was as if leaving the mountains behind gave me a chance to leave everything that had happened there too. I desperately wanted to forget and try to return to my usual life, to regain the harmony that Mike and I once had. Home was where everything was supposed to be the same as before. I tried to act as normal as possible. I unpacked, helped my parents, and then returned to my own house to finally see Mike. Seeing him was like a balm for my soul. His smile, his warm embrace, his voice that constantly reassured me that everything would be okay. I genuinely believed that I could restore what we once had. I could forget. I could start over if I just tried hard enough. Everything that had happened with James, all that passion, was supposed to fade away like a bad dream. But the silence of the house and the quietness within me did not last long. A day after returning home, I heard the sound of a notification on my phone. It was a message from Mike. Just a few words lit up on the screen. "We need to talk." My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run through my entire body. My hands started trembling, and I could barely hold on to the phone. I tried to convince myself that it might just be something minor, something ordinary. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Mike wouldn't have used such a tone if it weren't important. Gathering my thoughts, I dialed his number, but he didn't pick up. I stared at the screen, at those short words that continued to pulse in my mind. "We need to talk." It was too serious, too direct. The next minute, another message came in. It contained only one attachment, a video. I opened it and immediately felt a wave of horror wash over me. On the screen, it was me and James. That very moment, that night I had hoped to leave in the past forever. A mix of anxiety, shame, and terror engulfed me. How did he know? How did he get this? I realized it was James who had done it. He had recorded our night, and now that video had ended up in Mike's hands. I couldn't believe what was happening. Everything inside me seemed to shatter. I felt tears start streaming down my face as my thoughts grew chaotic. I couldn't find an excuse, couldn't figure out what to say or do. I needed to talk to Mike, but what could I say to him? How could I explain this? Everything we had was now destroyed, and I knew there was no way back. The only thing left was to meet him and try to explain somehow. But how could I explain something that I myself couldn't understand? Mike came home later than usual, and the look in his eyes was different. The moment he stepped through the door, I felt something inside me break. He didn't smile, didn't hug me like he used to. Instead, his eyes were cold, and I knew that he had seen the video, that he knew everything. "We need to talk," he said, barely containing his anger. His voice was quiet, but in that calmness, I could feel the force of a hurricane about to break loose. "Mike, please," I began, trying to find the right words. My heart was tight with fear. "Let me explain." "Explain what, Claire?" He cut me off, his voice getting louder with each second. "How could you do this? You were with him. You betrayed me." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I wanted to say something, but every word felt empty. I knew he was right. I knew there was no excuse for me. All I could offer was an apology, but even that seemed meaningless. My attempts to explain that it was a mistake, that it was a one-time thing, sounded so pathetic that I wanted to stop talking altogether. Mike looked at me with such despair and pain that I felt like pieces of my world were falling apart. It didn't mean anything," I said. but even I couldn't believe my own words. Mike let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Nothing? It didn't mean anything? His voice cracked with emotion, and it hurt even more. How can you say that when it destroyed everything we had? He turned away from me as if he couldn't stand to look at me anymore. I reached out to touch his hand, but he pulled away. I felt like I was losing him, like everything we had was slipping away. He grabbed his things and left the house without saying another word, leaving me in absolute silence. I was alone, surrounded only by memories of what we once had and what was now lost. A few hours passed before I gathered the courage to meet with James. I needed to understand why he had done this, why he had destroyed my life. I called him, and he agreed to meet at a nearby cafe. My hands were still trembling as I walked inside and saw him sitting there. He was smiling, as if he was satisfied with everything that had happened. "Glad you came," he said when I approached. His confidence only fueled my anger. I sat down across from him, trying not to show how much I was struggling. "Why did you do it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, but the anger broke through. James leaned back in his chair, his gaze calm, as if this was just a casual conversation. "Because you belong to me, Claire. I couldn't stand the pretense any longer. Now everything is out in the open, and now we can be together." I couldn't believe his words. His arrogance, his calmness, it all made me feel a mix of rage and fear. I had come here to get answers, but instead I saw a man who didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, what he had done. He was confident that I would simply accept him after everything that had happened. "You're insane, James," I said, struggling to hold back tears. "You destroyed everything. You took away everything that mattered to me." He leaned closer, his voice soft, but it brought no comfort. "But I'm here, Claire. Now we have a chance. Nothing is standing in our way anymore." I stood up, not knowing what else to say. I felt scared and hurt, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. He didn't understand, or didn't care, that I had lost not only Mike, but also a part of myself in all of this. There was no love, no desire to stay with him, only emptiness and pain. I walked out of the cafe, leaving him there, hoping I would never have to see his face again.